So Dave Kanzer, I'm actually with the Colorado River Districts. I'll get into it, but we're a subdivision of the state of Colorado. So today I'm not speaking on behalf of Colorado because Andrew had to go leave and catch a plane, unfortunately. But I'm very familiar with what's going on in Colorado, and I'll talk about Colorado's programs, and then I'll jump into what we're doing at the Colorado River District, which is a special district or subdivision of the state of Colorado. So Colorado has 8 permanent programs across the state. 7 of those are ground-based programs, and 1 is an aerial program. So the map is not quite complete here, not showing it all graphically, but essentially we have really good coverage across the Continental Divide on the west side, which is really key to the Colorado River Basin, which I thought we might have an overview of, but I'll cover some of that too in my talk. Because the Colorado River Basin, much different than what we've been talking about here in Idaho, got some unique characteristics and some great cooperation through 7 basin states. And again, I don't know, Sean, are you going to be talking about it
next?
Okay. So kind of jumping in and out, so you'll hear some of this maybe more than once. It's good to reinforce those topics, I think, anyway. But so the map, again, spatially, this is just sort of the spine of the Rockies, and to the west, the state of Colorado is the permitting agency for all these programs. And so they issue permits for these regions, whether again they're ground-based or aerial. Overall, there's about 27 remote generators in the program and 72 manuals across the state. So pretty significant, maybe just a little bit smaller than Utah's that you heard about earlier. The funding is sort of a portfolio approach where we get monies from the lower basin states that you'll hear about through a cooperative agreement. And then the state of Colorado has their own funding. And then local districts like my own and some of these folks in these shaded polygons here are self-funding as well. So you'll hear about this programmatic agreement with the lower basin. It's been going on since 2018, a very successful program. And so as we move through these slides, you know, some of these things will not be a surprise after a full day of looking at these, so I won't belabor it, except that, you know, the state is a regulatory agency. They are not operating the programs. The local districts are primarily doing these works. They are supporting through financial contractual arrangements and basically supporting operations, upgrades, studies, modeling, and evaluation. Again, you've heard a lot of these things, and it's in place, making a difference across the state of Colorado. Here's what the funding looks like. You can see it's significant, but not the most significant investment. Again, as you're seeing a lot of interest in cloud seeding grow, same thing in Colorado. And again, giving a hint here to the distribution of funding coming from the 3 agencies in the lower basin, Nevada, Arizona, California, and a small amount from New Mexico. So it's a significant program. It's complex in its reach and its funding. And, you know, it's been growing, as I said. This plot shows sort of a time series by program, the number of hours, seating hours per program per year, and you'll see kind of an ebb and flow. The orange bars represents the Central Colorado Mountain River Basin program. I'll talk about that more in a minute, but that's the program that I personally manage. And again, we set records last year. No surprise, it was a great year for seeding based on conditions. And you'll see a few interesting things here where Vail, Beaver Creek in the blue, used to be a leader in the program, and in fact, the history there is really interesting, going back to the early 70s. One of the first ones to seed in Colorado. After the pandemic, we sort of lost support for that program, but they're sort of emblematic of our efforts that, again, ebb and flow with ski areas and other cooperators to try to get interest in the program and investments. You'll also see a new one, the St. Vrain, for the first time on the eastern side of the Rockies, trying to seed and take advantage of some of those extra area effects, and also directly targeting some east slopes of the Rockies. So, like all states, you've heard about suspension criteria. Won't have to belabor this, except the same issues are there that limit our abilities to seed at all times. There's some really interesting tools that NRCS has developed in conjunction with other agencies, state and federal, as well as the Colorado Avalanche Information Center, which really helps us look at avalanche hazards, and obviously we curtail when those agencies are exceeding the criteria that are published under the permits. Make sure I got everything that Andrew had on his notes. You know, the seeding has started this year already. We had a quick start. We typically go from November to April, thereabouts. We've had 2 seedable storms across the northern portion of the area, so that's good news. So always likes to show this remote. This was built by Desert Research Institute. We're getting several more of these. These are remotely controlled units on wheels that can be moved around, and this was named for Joe Busto. So some of you knew about Joe. Unfortunately, he passed, but this is sort of a testament to his imprint on and influence on Colorado cloud seeding. So that leads me to myself and my talk, as I just rushed through Andrew's notes. Hopefully I did him proud. It says state of Colorado, but really we are a subdivision state at the Colorado River districts. And so I'm going to zero in on this green polygon that you saw earlier and tell you a little bit more specifics about our CCMRB, Central Colorado Mountain River Basin Program. Encompasses 4 counties. On the ground, we've got 20 to 25 generators. Each year it changes depending on funding, also depending on prevailing conditions. But we have a program and a footprint that's responds to and is flexible to those conditions as they change. In addition, we've got 4 remotely operated ground-based generators. We're really trying to expand the remote operations or generators, as you can guess, moving away from the manuals. We've got a budget of about $330,000 of combined funds, and again, that's state and local. So again, I'm going to jump in and give a little bit of overview about the Colorado River Basin and why, how we fit in at the Colorado River District and why we find cloud seeding to be so significantly important. You can kind of see where we sit in the entire Colorado River Basin and the 7 states therein. What you'll also see is these dark areas that depend upon exports from the Colorado River Basin. It's, as some people like to say, or I like to say, it's sort of the James Brown of rivers. It's one of the hardest working rivers out there. And it really does services 40 million people, 7 states, 2 countries, and right in the middle there, Lee Ferry is our sort of compliance point. There are measurements there that dictate who gets what. It's the foundation of what we call the law of the river. And again, so we are under stress in the basin. as you can guess, and as you'll see through the following slides. But the Colorado River District, here shown in sort of psychedelic colors. This is 15 counties. There, here you can kind of see where we fit within Colorado itself. Only about a third of the state, but it's mostly high elevation. It's extremely productive when it comes to snow. One of my favorite top stats, fun facts, 60 to 70% of the natural flow of Colorado River at that magic compliance point, Lee Ferry, arises in our little slice of heaven here in my backyard. Again, our program, you can kind of see the mouse, is here, but we do have other programs that extend in the Gunnison Basin and point south. We do not manage or I should say we're a policy and planning agency only, non-regulatory, but we exclude the San Juan Basin, sub-basin of Colorado River. So again, the other interesting thing here, you'll see of that significant yield of the Colorado River, most of it comes from about 8,500 feet. That's what this map is showing by elevation. So it's super important to optimize the resources in those high elevation areas. Really the sweet spot between 8,500 and about 10,000, 11,000 feet. The bulk of the snowfall arises and is retained there, which is only about 15% of the upper Colorado River Basin. So really important to kind of understand and to optimize and leverage that geography with cloud seeding. So, you know, again, policy and planning is what we do. Protection, conservation, use, and development, focused on the Colorado River and those threats that would sort of dewater those areas. And some of that is here again, if you're not familiar with Colorado and the dynamics, you know, the 80% of the water on the west side and, you know, 85% of the people or more living in the greater Front Range area. Yep. And you can kind of see the river basins. And so it's dramatic, sort of what I call a tug of war. You'll see that, you know, the way that we meet the demands, and I say we, the state of Colorado, exporting water from the Colorado River through trans-basin diversions, you know, almost 500,000 acre-feet leaves the natural basin never to return through about 25 ditches and tunnels. The list is shown here. So a significant impact. And again, a lot of pressure within our area here. The other thing to point out in the overview of the basin, about 90% of the water above Lee Ferry, about 90% of the people below Lee Ferry. So it's really, to me, fascinating and makes life interesting, shall we say. May we all live in interesting times. And so we have friends and colleagues across the basin, but obviously makes for interesting conversations. So that's us in our little district, stretched thin, competition for limited resources, and so we need to meet the needs within Colorado while still meeting the obligations under the law of the Colorado River, the Colorado River Compact, and the whole compendium of agreements. So that's, you know, graphically showing how we feel every day. And this is, again, what we're faced with. And I'm sure everybody here that's a water resource manager deals with these things. But what we're trying to do is make the rope stronger through augmentation, right? So pretty obvious things here. But the pressures not only are from exports and from use, it's from warming. And again, this graphic, I think, is extremely powerful when you look at how the bullseyes of climate change are being observed. Our district there outlined, you can see in the observed record since the late 1800s, you know, 4 to almost, well, over 4 degrees of Fahrenheit rise in temperatures since that time. This is not modeled, these are observed data, and of course that's a pretty strong drawing pressure on our resource. So it's kind of a triple whammy when you think about it. Probably don't need to say this, but I will anyway. You know, we have allocated water based on a stable supply. We really don't have a stable supply. We have a decreasing trend. Cloud seeding is sort of our hedge against that. And again, that's why my board of directors and the state of Colorado are in the game, so to speak, on weather modification and cloud seeding in particular. So I've raced through that stuff. There's a lot more information. We've got social media channels. This is how you find us. And I'm really pleased to be here. I should have said at the beginning, thank you for inviting us to represent. So thanks. We'll look forward to talking to you.
Well, and actually, in the spirit of cooperation, DK helped me a lot with some, because I can skip over some of the slides that I had, and more just talk about the agreement and the cooperation that we do have going on. So as DK touched on, there's a map of the Colorado River Basin, and this water drop graphic on the side shows under normal conditions how much water everyone gets. That adds up to about 16 million acre feet. But realistically, the flows of the river lately are, I think, closer to 13 or 14. So it obviously creates an issue of the supply balance and the inflows coming in. Let's see here. So inflows, this is a similar statistic. I don't know if DK, your slides just talked about Colorado with the land mass and contributions, but so here's a picture of the basin that it's a very similar number, where the inflow, 92% of the inflow contributions come from the upper Colorado River Basin, and you get only about 8% coming from the lower. But the important thing, and that this map illustrates, is that 92% of the supply comes from only 20% of the landmass in the upper basin. You know, much of it in Colorado, gets up in Wyoming, and then in Utah. So I think everyone in the basin recognizes the importance of that area and trying to get more supply in that area. Hence, we've been helping cooperatively fund cloud seeding projects since 2007. That we had an agreement that we entered into in 2018, but up before then, we would all just individually, you know, California 6-Agency Committee, the Central Arizona Project, Southern Nevada Water Authority, and the New Mexico Interstate Stream Commission. We would all contribute individually to these projects, and it worked out really well, because the one thing that you probably noticed from all these presentations is these programs are all run differently. So there's not really a one-size-fits-all type of solution in order to fund these. So some of our, like my management wanted a more streamlined approach to funding it. So the projects, instead of going to our board with some of these projects every year, we said, okay, well, let's look forward to 2026 and come up with a way to a programmatic funding agreement. So we always emphasize that it's a programmatic funding agreement. It's not a programmatic weather mod program where everyone's sort of doing the same thing. I think that's a very important take home, is that all the states, local entities, they need to keep operating in the same way. You don't really want to put it one size fits all on there. So let's see here. On to the next. So this is a really interesting map here. This is a map based on the reports we received from the individual states and the entities. These are all the generators, the ground-based generators. So you see they're all, and some outside the basin there. I think all of Utah's just sort of fall. I got all their generators, not just Colorado River Basin ones. So that just shows like the cooperations that's been going on and has gone on in the past. You have Central Arizona Water Conservation District, aka CUP, Southern Nevada Water Authority, 6-Agency Committee, California, Mexico Stream Commission, Wyoming Water Development Office, and CWCD, Utah Division of Water Resources. So, as stated earlier today, it's important. I think this works because everyone agrees that this water becomes system water. It's not. We don't tally up how many acre feet here, how many acre feet there. We don't also we could also make the proportional argument. It's like, well, California uses the most water. Maybe they should be paying more than other people. And I think if we started talking about that, things would fall apart really quickly. It would not work. So I think that really drives that point home that you really need to look at this as a benefit to the system as a whole. And one thing I'm really proud of that every year we have we meet. We have I think the process is very important. We have a technical committee that we all get together in July of the year before the operations start to meet. Say, hey, here's where the states say, Upper Basin states entities say, here's what we're thinking of funding this year. So we get together, meet over that, figure out where that money would be best spent. You know, from the Lower Basin, the agreement is for $1.5 million per year from the Lower Basin up to the Upper Basin. So basically $500,000 each from Arizona, California, and Nevada, and then as DK said, that New Mexico Industry Stream Commission kicks in $20,000 for the San Juan program, and I'm glad we're doing that, because before it was sort of just 6 states doing it, it would have looked sort of weird. So New Mexico's getting their toes in the water with the weather modification and kicking in for that. So that's great that we have everything, and I'm also proud that every year we send a document around to all 7 Colorado River Basin states, get it signed. And you don't see that in too many places where we all sign this exhibit to say, hey, here's where we agree, the Lower Basin agrees on funding for the Upper Basin. So yeah, like I said, I think that the process is important to have in setting up an agreement like this, it's important to have a timeline. I think that was actually the biggest part where we were debating, is just what the timeline would look like, when we would pay, who would pay who, when we get deliverables, when we would meet on those items. That actually sort of became the longest part of setting this programmatic agreement up. So and sort of building on the success of this programmatic agreement in our technical committee, we gained the attention of the Bureau of Reclamation, the Lower Colorado River Operations Office. They have a pool of money that they have where they give out directed grants for combating drought. So normally when in the Lower Basin, when you think of saving water, it's land fallowing or making agriculture more efficient, or ripping out lawns as if you've ever visited Las Vegas. There's personal injury attorney commercials, and there's rip out your lawn commercials. That's what it seems to be all on the local TV commercials down there. So someone at Reclamation said, hey, I'd like to see this money go towards like cloud seeding operations, which I just almost dropped the phone when I heard that, so I thought that was very, very good. And so we have SNWA was awarded the grant, and the reason for that, but the purpose of the money is to fund operations and research now, I'll talk about that in a second, in the Upper Basin. SNWA has worked with the Lower Colorado River Office of Reclamation a lot for grants that we get for our Las Vegas wash. It's a riparian area where a lot of our wastewater flows through for return flow guides. So we already had a good mechanism. We had the staff set up to handle the reporting requirements, because there's reporting requirements that come with the grant. There's audit requirements that come with the grant. So they said, let's put it through SNWA, but then we will work through this technical committee to distribute that money. And so we're working at this. That's what we're working on right now, is this grant reimbursement workflow. It's a little complicated. We're working out some of the kinks in that. So basically, it stays at the local and state level. I just said state entity there just to be generic, but they're contracting the work, and then they're sending the invoice up the chain to us. We get reimbursed from Reclamation, send the money back down to reimburse. So we're still this agreement we received the grant award back in the spring. We still haven't spent any money yet. We're looking at buying some radiometers as a first step. Looking at doing, that's that's what the guy at Radiometrics is saying too. Because the one thing you really have to caution with this grant money, it's almost like that movie Brewster's Millions we were talking about. You get all this money and spend it, and one of the initial concerns that came up first is like, well, we don't want to invest in a giant like aerial program or do all this equipment, and then when the money runs out, he's stuck holding these recurring operating costs. So we thought a radiometer, even though that comes with an operating expense, that would be an excellent tool to put out there. We thought, you know, get some generators out there. And then one of the states asked, like, well, we want to start doing some, we didn't initially have feasibility or program evaluations in there, and so we felt that would be a good use for the money. So we approached Reclamation, and we're working on that right now to get those two items added to the grant, which I think will be a good use for that money as well. We're also, the original timeline was, the deadline to use this money was January 2025, and we thought that was, with the way some of these projects evolved, that wasn't enough time, so we were able to add another year to it. It's like we were under the impression at first that we had till 2025, and so we got another year to it, and they're like, yeah, and we're like, okay, let's do that then. So, so that's just, I think it's been a great success story. We're getting putting this money to work, and like I said, we got the attention of this because of the success of our cooperative funding agreement that we have. So in the interest of time, that's all I have.
You want to talk about the state of Nevada except for Las Vegas? Las Vegas is its own entity in terms of water and everything else. So we have the Greater Nevada State Program, which basically provides water and extra snowfall for the parts of the rest of the state. So Nevada is the driest state in the U.S. We have some primary areas that are significant for the important water supplies. And number one is the Sierra Nevada. We have 3 rivers that run off the east side of the Sierra Nevada into Nevada, and they serve both farming and urban areas, and through the Truckee, the Carson, and the Walker rivers. And then out in eastern Nevada, it's out here in northeastern Nevada, there's a river called the Humboldt River, which starts up in the Jarvidge and the Ruby Mountains up here and heads out to the east and then, or to the west, and ends up in a sink out here. And so this is important ranch land and farming, and there's a few small towns. And then most of the rest of Nevada is basin and range. So every one of these are all ridges. We have, I think, we have a lot of mountain ranges in Nevada, and they're all isolated basin. So you have all these ridges, and between each one of these ridges you have a basin, and each basin is its own thing, and no water gets out of these basins. So you have hundreds of independent basins inside the state that are isolated from each other in terms of water supply. And they include some higher ranges like these mountains here, and then down here the Spring Mountains that I talked about a little bit earlier. And obviously these mountain ranges have different storm tracks that are important to bring that moisture into these mountain areas that are, of course, up here in northern Nevada, the interior northern Nevada. We have the primary storm tracks come in from the northwest over the Cascades, but the Cascades are these isolated peaks. A lot of moisture can make it over the Cascades and around the high peaks and get in here. That drives snowfall in these locations. The Sierra Nevada's southwesterly flow right off the Pacific. These mountains just get crushed with snowfall, and sometimes some of the snowiest mountains in the U.S. And then the Great Basin ranges in the southern part, the moisture has to get south of the Sierra Nevada before it can bring any moisture in. So the Spring Mountains in these areas, the primary storm track is on southwestern flow. So cloud seeding's been done in Nevada for almost 60 years now. Some of the scientists in Nevada, some of the first scientists at the Desert Research Institute were cloud seeders. And some of the mountain ranges, the Sierra and the Rubies, were seeded as early as 1962. There were some big federal projects. Desert Research Institute was critical, and especially in the Sierra Nevada ones. The research continued into the 70s with lots of research programs. And the results of these research programs suggested that the snowfall was being enhanced, but at where we are today, we don't really know by how much. I think they came up with, this is where maybe the first 10% came up with. They were estimating about 0.1 inch of SWE per 0.1 per 1 inch of SWE, or 1 inch of snowfall per 10 inches of snow. And just as an aside, this is the DRI had a research aircraft back in the day, back in the 60s and the 70s. And this aircraft actually ended up crashing in 1980 on a flight over the sea, on a cloud seeding / icing flight, killed all 4 people on board. So it's kind of one of the tragedies of DRI. And I actually gave a talk on the accident, which maybe someday I'll get to the cloud seeding community.
Is that at Twin Beach?
I'm not sure which one this is. They had one. I think this one's from the 60s.
Yeah.
I think it was, I want to say a B-22, but I don't, basically what happened is after World War II, there was a bunch of aircraft hanging around that, all these old bombers that were no longer needed. And I think if you were like a research group, you could get your hands on these. And there were some companies that retrofitted them for instrumentation. And like every scientist ever, they put on so much stuff on there that some of the ideas was overloaded with equipment, and the center of gravity was shifted back a little bit. And so when it iced up going over the Sierra, there's this weird, it's hard to get the data, but there's some evidence of like this weird up and down kind of oscillation. And then they were loaded with ice, and they came down, they stalled once, and they recovered, and then they dropped down and went above freezing. And I guess all the ice started moving, and it stalled a second time. And this time it went over, where they weren't able to recover. So anyway, sorry, that's not really what I'm talking about today. So after doing these 25, 30 years of research, they came up with what they called the chain of events. And the chain of events to conduct successful cloud seeding. Cloud seeding material must be successfully and reliably produced. And we talk about that. You got to continue to have a good supply of cloud seeding material during storms. The second thing is the seeding material has to be transported into the region of the cloud that has this super cooled liquid water. We know that. And the seeding material's got to be dispersed into the super cooled liquid water so that enough volume of cloud's affected so we can grow the ice in the water drops. You can't just have like a small area with a bunch of ice that doesn't have any water associated with it, or it's not going to grow to precipitation size. So you want to seed and then have that ice spread throughout the super cooled water portion of the cloud. Temperature's got to be cold enough for new ice production. And then the last thing, the new ice has to be in a super cooled liquid portion of the cloud to grow to precipitation size. And so they're all the critical results of the research. And so after this research was done in 1975 through 77, there was a pretty severe drought in the western U.S. Lots of people, like older folks, like they remember this thing. And the governor of Nevada came to DRI and asked them about, well, can you guys help us out now? We're having a lot of water resource issues. Before this, everything was research. And so the state came and said, well, can you guys, if we kick you some money, can we do some operational cloud seeding? And DRI was like, sure, we'll give it a shot. And so DRI started doing cloud seeding for the state, and in the right around 75, 76, and they were successful in terms of the way they, did their validation, and the program was designed using the chain of events, and everybody was pretty happy, and so that was the beginning of the Nevada State Cloud Seeding Program. The state program was considered a research/operational program, so the state required research to be done every year. It wasn't just an operational, there always had to be some type of research done. And the program continued for over 30 years, and it ended in 2009 and 10 after the Great Recession crushed Nevada's budget, and so they had to cut it. They axed the program. And at that year, the state funding was $500K per year. And the state funded everything. There was no local support. So when the state pulled the plug, it was pretty much a full-on crisis, like the program was going to go down the tubes because there was nobody else to participate. And the estimates of the state program, they were estimating between 50 and 75,000 acre-feet of additional snowfall a year, and the estimate was about $10 an acre-foot. Some of the accomplishments, they pioneered the remote control generator back in the 1980s, and this is some stuff that's still used today. These generators are up on the mountaintops or up on the ridges where they're in the mainstream flow above the inversion, and you don't have as much challenges with vertical mixing of the plume to get it into the proper portions of the clouds. DRI also pioneered the improvement of the silver iodide molecule. Back in the old days, they would just release silver iodide. The hope was silver iodide was just going to float around and crash into a drop and freeze it, and that wasn't that efficient. So what they came up with was if you combine the silver iodide with a salt molecule, then you get condensation on the salt, and then you have a silver iodide molecule inside the drop, so you have the ice nuclei as part of the drop, and so that's much more efficient at creating ice nucleation, and that was some of the stuff. They also pioneered the use of trace chemistry for cloud seeding validation, and I still use that all the time to this day. So after the state program ended, things got a little tough. We were able to keep the Tahoe Truckee program alive through local Reno funding. The Ruby Mountains was actually funded by the Southern Nevada Water Authority for 3 years, which they had absolutely nothing to do with the Ruby Mountains. They just were like great state participants. And then after 2012, that was gone. And so we started diversifying at this point. We moved into Colorado and started trying to do some projects in Colorado, and we just started trying to hustle up local funding because there was nothing available on the federal level. And we limped along for 13 years, and just this past legislative session, we were able to get the state program refunded. And so, yeah, it took a lot of crying and begging and boozing down at the state capitol, but we were able to get a 2-year program past $600K. And like somebody else had already said, by this point, nobody in the legislature knows anything about cloud seeding. So they had to be fully educated. We got unanimous approval from both the Assembly and the Senate. 0 no votes, which I think that's partly because the opponents were caught flat-footed. They didn't even know it was coming. So we'll see how it goes. So our goal here is to make sure we educate the legislature folks over the next 2 years and see if we can keep it going. And so anyway, we're running a statewide program again. We have the Sierra Nevada, the Rubies, the Santa Rosa Mountains up here, and then we have the Spring Mountains. So these are our project areas right now. Everything's ground-based at the moment. We're looking into this Diamond Range, which is right here. This is really got some issues with water overuse. And then we're also thinking about taking a look at this Jarbidge Range, which is not that important to Nevada, but there's some folks up here in Idaho that have run off the north side of these mountains, and they're definitely seedable. We did a feasibility study up there, so that's another area that we're kind of trying to do some research in. And then we do have matching funds. Here's all our matching partners. I'm not going to talk about that. And I also want to point out this picture here. This is a picture of rime ice. This is the stuff that's going by in clouds that isn't precipitating out. And so what we're trying to do is take the droplets that are free, that can be seen frozen on there, and converting them to snowfall, and that's where the extra fuel to create the snowfall comes from. So I'll just let that sit up there, and yeah. So anyway, that's the Nevada program.
Yeah, my name is Matthew Scudato. I'm a senior hydrologist with Santa Barbara County. I'm in no way a meteorologist. I'm a program manager for the cloud seeding program. My role is strictly to work with the contractors, the board of supervisors for Santa Barbara County. I operate our leases on private properties and kind of coordinate with 9 partners throughout Santa Barbara who help with the funding. And deal with the public inquiries as well. I can't speak for all of California, but currently there are 16 operational programs. Most, as you can see from this slide, are for snowpack up in the Sierra. Tend to be funded by power utilities for hydropower, water resources, additional supplies, conservation districts, and ski areas. Our program, let's see if I can, oh, here we go. Now, my program, compared to what a lot of people have seen throughout the day, is much smaller scale in comparison. So our function and our goal is primarily to enhance rainfall in the watersheds above 2 of the major reservoirs in Santa Barbara County, North County and South County. Each reservoir holds about 195,000 acre feet. The northern reservoir called Twitchell Dam, that's strictly for flood control and very slow summer release for the recharge of a groundwater basin. Lake Achuma, down along the San Ynez target area, is primarily water distribution to some of the larger cities such as Santa Barbara, Goleta, Montecito, and there are a couple of other smaller 5,000, 6,000 foot reservoirs above Lake Achuma. So these are our main focus areas. We contract and have been contracting for quite some time with North American Weather Consultants. And this program has actually been operational consistently since 1981. So it's been going on for 50 plus years. And the program kind of changes each year depending on what the participants want and how much water is within the reservoir. So we can have a strictly ground-based program, which is, as you can see, these kind of round black dots. So we have about 7 operational ground sites. Or at times we'll have an airplane as well. We did have one last year. Yeah, we don't get much rain here along the Central Coast. The program tends to be operational December through March. And in an attempt to save kind of some funding, we keep the ground sites operational longer, and we just kind of focus the airplane during the months of high rain intensity, which would be January through March. This is just a graph of about 50 years worth of precipitation in Santa Barbara. It's really highly variable. And, as you can see from the last 12 years, 9 of those years were below average. Really created a lot of issues in terms of reservoir management, allocations, operations. So we try to use cloud seeding as a source of increasing this rainfall and capturing that with behind our reservoirs. These are the storage within those reservoirs. And as you can see in recent years, particularly 2017, as a result of the drought, we were in a bit of a pickle because along the coast here, really it takes 2 or 3 major storms to make or break us. Those storms, like I said, are January through March, and we try to use the cloud seeding program to help augment rainfall between these larger storms. Yeah. So, and actually to back that up, and if we're kind of lacking on allocations for our Cachuma Reservoir, say, we do end up having to pump quite a bit from our groundwater basins, which tends to cause a lot of issues for, we've been over pumping, and some basins are let's just say they've been overpumped for many years now. So within Santa Barbara, we actually started this back in 1950. It wasn't a consistent program. I know the research was done back in 1946. So within 4 years of kind of the discovery of cloud seeding, there was cloud seeding sponsored by the city of Santa Barbara along the San Ynez River. That was done for about 5 years. And we had the benefit of quite a lot of research before the Water Agency took over this program. So the state of California and the University of California did a randomized study back in the late 50s, early 60s, and the result of that research showed about a 45% increase in rainfall along the Santa Ynez. They continued to study orographic clouds and continued with the research with the help of the Naval Weapons Center in China Lake, which is actually the study that our program right now is based on. So we did have the benefit of a lot of prior research to build from. In 2015, and since we do have quite a large data set now, because this program's been going on for quite a few years, 24 to 27 storms were used and statistical analysis was done, which showed the results of that were that we're getting about a 20% increase within our southern reservoir, a 20% increase of rainfall, and about a 9% increase in our northern areas. And I know this has been said quite a bit today, and I totally support this, is continued studies and evaluation of one's program. How can we, what changes need to be made? Do we need more ground sites? Do we need to move those ground sites? Can we hit different storms to increase and improve that rainfall? So currently we're in now with new modeling and advances in modeling. We're in another study with DRI right now. Frank's working on helping us evaluate our program, see what changes can be made for improvements. And that tends to help me work with my partners and the public to show that we are getting a benefit from this program as well. So like I said, we have an airplane, we have some ground sites. The ground sites have about 32 flares. They're operated remotely. We work with North American Weather Consultants, so they operate this through actually in Salt Lake City. The flares are within these spark arresters. Really quick video. So that was a test run we did a couple of years ago. And this would be a plane we have. We used a plane last year, but hadn't used one in a few years prior to that. Now, here we go. Now, we fund our program a little differently than many. Like I said, the program will vary each year depending on length, ground sites. Sometimes we have to shut down certain areas as a result of fire. We've had quite a few fires in recent years. But the Water Agency will always sponsor 50% of the program, and the other 50% is distributed between 9 other agencies, all who benefit from the increase in precipitation behind these reservoirs. So what we do to break up the funding between the 9 agencies is base that on their annual water use and production. So they pay more if they use more. And we also now have the benefit, I know Kayla kind of mentioned this earlier, leveraging funds. We share some infrastructure with San Luis Obispo County, located north of us. We share 2 of our ground sites, and last year we shared an airplane as well. Airplane was used for Lopez Lake, Twitchell, and Cachuma. It definitely cut down our costs and the costs for San Luis Obispo as well. I did keep this short, but when I took over this job in 2016, we didn't really have a lot of data online, and I was receiving an enormous amount of interest and calls from the public. So I did beef up our web pages. All of the research is made publicly available, all of the operational programs from every year with a really good summary. And I noticed by just having this available to the public, it's definitely cut down on phone calls and my time, just allowing people to research what they need on their own.
So, hi, everybody. So I'm Rachel Gray, the Water Resources Planning Manager. Not a meteorologist, but this has been a great experience for me in learning about it. So our program is 1 day old. It literally kicked off today. So we're pretty excited about that. So next slide, please. So just a little bit of an overview. We conducted our feasibility study back in 2020 to determine, if implementation of a program would be economically and technically feasible. We also contracted with North American Weather Consultants. They're operating our program. It's a 4-year pilot program. And so in the Santa Ana River watershed, our target areas are the mountain areas that you see in yellow here that drain into our watershed. We have the Santa Ana River as well as groundwater basins. So we're hoping that this can be, sort of a addition to our water supply strategy for recharge and supply in our basin. So, sorry. Okay. So sorry. One more thing on the previous slide. I just to reiterate, validation is critical for us for our pilot program because the results can then help, to advance a long-term program for us in our watershed and then communications as well. So next slide, Kayla. So just funding. So SAPA itself is a joint powers authority. And so we have 5 member agencies who are funding our program together with 8 additional agencies within our watershed. Next slide, please. We also applied for Proposition 1 grant funding from the Department of Water Resources, and we were able to secure about $860,000 for the 4-year program as well. Next slide. So just a summary, we have 15 ground-based seeding site or units. We have 11 sponsors. You'll see the green are the CNGs. We have 1 remotely operated CNG and then 3 automated high output ground seeding units in our watershed that we're utilizing. No aerial seeding is being done for our watershed. Next slide, please. So consistent with my previous sort of discussion on CEQA, the findings for us were a couple biological mitigation measures related to, conducting a biological survey 10 days prior to the installation of the equipment, as well as just being aware of the nesting season. We were outside of the nesting season, so that was okay. And then also if there's any cultural, fines, and then we had to develop an unanticipated discoveries plan as well related to tribal cultural resources. Next slide, please. So just, in advance of installing our units, we wanted to conduct a preliminary biological survey to ensure that the locations where we're going to, install the units, there were no issues with sensitive, species or flora, fauna. So we did an initial biological survey in late July, and so there were no significant findings identified. Next slide, please. Fast forward, just to comply with that 10 day in advance of the construction, we completed our final biological survey. Again, no significant findings, but we wanted to minimize the risk when we were going to install the units. Next slide, please. So just our project team, SAPA, our operators are back up. Not North American Weather Consultants, they're operating the program, and Frank from DRI, he's going to be helping us with some validation over the 4 years of the project. Next slide, please. So we developed an operations plan. And just because it's a new program for us, we wanted to make sure that, we had an externally and internally facing document that we can share to sort of outline hey, here are our operational criteria, here are suspension criteria, so on and so forth. And if you go to the next slide, Kayla, it'll kind of describe some of the information that's in our operations plan. Like I said, when are we going to seed? When are we going to suspend? And how are we going to communicate? Next slide, please. So these 2 slides is just like a schedule that was developed. I'm not planning on going over it, just with the installation schedule and coordinating with all our site sponsors. So it took some work and coordination, but we got it done. So next slide. Next slide. Thank you. And then, yeah, just key timeline. So we conducted our preliminary biological surveys. We had to do a 45-day public notice of submission. And then we had our equipment set up, operator training, and, you'll see November 15th. It's actually, I don't know. It's great that we're having our workshop on the day that our program's starting. So it's kind of momentous. So like I said, day one. Next slide, please. Again, we're partnering with Frank and these Desert Research Institute, and just the validation for us is key, like I said, for implementation of a long-term program. And so, just the purpose is to verify, the deposition of silver iodide, verify any increases in precipitation and stream flows, maybe associated by target areas, so we can see maybe long-term who could also contribute to funding this program. And then just, independent review of North American weather consultants, like their operation and the suspension criteria. So that's critical as well to the success of our program. So next slide, please. And again, we're just using some, verifying the silver and the snow before and after seeding, as well as the target control methods for 2 areas. Next slide, please, Kayla. So again, it's just critical. Communication is critical for us. I mean, it's been day one and I've gotten probably like a handful of emails already like, hey, are you guys seeding? And it so happens that it's raining a little bit here, although it's not conducive to cloud seeding quite yet. So we're monitoring the conditions. Yeah, just all the different mechanisms, whether it's our website or, facts, FAQs, or just different outreach mechanisms, just making sure that we have information available. We set up a special weather modification email address, and then so the public can send us questions. So just making sure that we're transparent with communication. Next slide, please. Yeah, and then just our general program schedule. So we're currently on day one of our 4-year pilot program. So yeah, excited to be part of this group, and thanks for having me.
Since you already heard from me earlier about some aspects of our program, I'll keep it short. I've got a lot of questions recently about how we determine who our partners are, how we identify who the partners are, and then how we determine their contribution to the program. So Utah's been cloud seeding for a long time. There were early experiments in the 50s. In the 70s, they passed the Cloud Seeding Act, which gave the Division of Water Resources authority to permit cloud seeding. And that's what we've been doing ever since. So part of the procedure, these are the local sponsors that we have. There's a range of water conservancy districts and public utilities, county governments, private companies, and these agencies contract directly with the cloud seeding operator. So they're the ones who are interested in cloud seeding. And if there's a drainage basin that's being targeted for cloud seeding, and there's more than one of these, they determine amongst themselves how they're going to divide the costs. So for example, Salt Lake City Public Utilities, they're the only ones that participate in the Six Creeks program. And so they contract with the operator and they pay the full cost. Whereas we have some that have up to 3 of these partners. And so then what I do is I inquire every year the interest of potential sponsors in participating in the state program, which is a reimbursement program. So our reimbursement is a 50-50 split up to a certain amount. So we say, we'll contract with you to reimburse your cloud seeding expenses up to a certain 50%, up to a certain amount. And then there are 2 operators. There's one private company and then one water district, and they have to go through the public process. they have to demonstrate the proper insurance, the proper expertise in order to obtain a license and a permit. And then we monitor for suspension criteria throughout the year. At the end of the year, we reimburse the sponsors and then hopefully celebrate a massive snow year. These are the areas where we target. I already went over the sponsors, local sponsors. We also have regional sponsors, which has been covered. Those are agencies in the lower Colorado River Basin. They pay for a number of things: extensions, seeding in some areas where we have no local support. They provide funding for instrumentation and also research. Okay, so then this is a table of the water budget and the statewide program. So you can see there I have the areas, the target areas, and then each of the local sponsors. And then you can see there's a breakdown between the board, which is the Board of Water Resources for the state, and then the sponsors support. And that's approximately 50-50. Then there's a total for Utah, and then there's the contribution from the regional sponsors. And so all these activities come out to about $800,000 per year. That changed last year when the state invested a considerable amount of money. They increased the budget to $5 million and gave us $12 million in one-time funding, which is an incredible amount of money that we're not able to spend responsibly. And we need time in order to plan and implement these things. So here's a timeline of how the cost breakdown has been since the Cloud Seeding Act was passed. You can see gray there is the state portion, blue is local. You can see that the cost share percentages have varied over time. Then you can see in 2007 we signed the programmatic agreement with the Lower Colorado River Basin entities. That's in green. And then you can see last year how the increased budget led to quite a dramatic increase in statewide expenditure. And so those expenditures came from implementing 2 aerial programs, well, 1 pilot program, actually not 2, 1 pilot program, and then purchasing and building remote generators and conducting some other research to identify areas that are not currently targeted, but seedable conditions. Okay, so then the way that we do our cost benefit in using regression techniques, which have been mentioned, which are simple and rather inexpensive. And the last study we did in 2017 gave an estimated increased runoff through all of our programs of 186,000 acre-feet. And given the cost, that came out to about $2.40. I think it's a bit underestimated. We're undergoing this study again to update these numbers. But importantly, we don't, because in our statute it says that augmented precipitation is treated as natural precipitation. And so that resolves a ton of conflict. So because of that, we're not really interested in knowing how much of the water that augmented precip that falls as snow becomes runoff, which then gets to a certain reservoir or a certain gate. We consider any additional water natural, and it becomes system water. So it's a benefit to the watershed. It's a benefit to everyone in the system. Kayla showed this earlier. You improved this quite a bit, because this doesn't mean anything to people here. It means something to people in Utah. But we have the state agency regulator. We have a private operator, and then we have a public university research organization. And so the relationship between these 3 is very important. So so I'll leave it there. Okay.
Thanks, Jake. And Kayla Golden, State of Idaho. I'm going to give sort of a high-level overview of our program, hopefully some of the stuff that you hadn't heard about yet today. So water management in Idaho, this is sort of key to understanding how the funding works here. So in Idaho, we have the Department of Water Resources and we have the Water Resource Board. And so our department, on one hand, is really responsible for all your water rights licensing, hydrology, groundwater, stream channel protection, sort of more of the regulation side of water. The Idaho Water Resource Board, on the other hand, is responsible for the state's maintaining the sustainability of the state's water supply. And so that includes formulation and implementation of the state water plan, implementation and financing of large water projects, and operation of programs that support sustainable management. And that includes our cloud seeding program. And so the Idaho Water Resource Board does have regular appropriations annually, and our cloud seeding program is funded out of the board's annual appropriations. This is just a high level of our agency. So the Water Resource Board, by contrast of the department, doesn't actually have its own staff. So it is an 8-member appointed body made up of no more than 50% one political faction. And so because they don't have their own staff, the department, in fact, has a directive to provide that staffing for them. And so while I am department staff, our primary role is to carry out the missions and goals of the Water Resource Board and the Planning and Projects Bureau, which is where I fall. So overview of history, overview of cloud seeding in Idaho. Like some other states, cloud seeding has been going on here intermittently for quite some time, about since 1950. But really it hasn't been consistently going on until about the late 90s. And so in Eastern Idaho, you may have heard Sean talk about earlier, we have some manual programs that have been operational over in Eastern Idaho since about the late 90s. And that program over there is 100% funded by local stakeholders. So we're pretty proud of it. It's a very unique program. They've been able to get by since the 90s on local funding. And this is actually the first year that they have made a request to the state for some level of funding to support their program. Idaho Power, as you heard from Sean earlier, they've been operational consistently since about 2003. And then where you're seeing some of these blue dollar signs, I don't know if you can see my cursor here in some of these years, that's where the state has really come on board and started funding. So really the state has only been participating in cloud seeding, for the last 7 or 8 years, at least from a financial perspective. And so in Idaho, we have what we call the Collaborative Cloud Seeding Program. And what is that? So the Collaborative Cloud Seeding Program is that 3-legged stool that I talked about earlier. So we have the Idaho Water Resource Board, who is the state agency charged with cloud seeding. They also provide funding for cloud seeding in Idaho. Idaho Power Company, who operates the program, our program experts, and then local stakeholders and water users in the basins where we operate who provide funding as well. So Idaho Power operates the program, and then the state and local water users provide the funding. And that currently includes 4 basins, the Boise, the Wood, 3 basins in the collaborative, Boise, the Wood, and the Upper Snake River Basin of Idaho. And then the Payette River Basin is the basin that Idaho Power started independently. They still operate, manage, and fund that basin independently. But it is done in collaboration with the other basins. So a high-level history of our program, as Sean talked about the inception, the stakeholder or shareholder question that they got that really kicked this off in the 1990s. They started their first operational program in 2003. And really the state came to the table, not in terms of funding, but came to the table to start talking about participation in cloud seeding in 2008. And this was a result of what we call the ESPA CAMP, or the Eastern Snake River Plain Aquifer Comprehensive Aquifer Management Plan. And so Idaho actually has one of the world's most productive aquifers, one of the largest in the United States, and that is primarily where the agriculture in our state lies, is over the ESPA. And so a brief, very high-level history that kind of puts this into context. We started irrigating across the ESPA, in the early 1990s, and through flood and surface water. And so what that did was actually artificially charge our aquifer. And then about the 1950s, when pumping came online, we started to see a decrease. So it's sort of a perfect bell-shaped curve with charging of the aquifer from incidental pumping came online in the 50s, and then we've seen a decline. And so that has been something that our state has been heavily trying to attack, is the decline of the ESPA aquifer, because it is very critical to our economy. And so because of that, the Water Resource Board and the state came to the table during that planning back in 2008, and Idaho Power proposed to put on a 5-year pilot project in the Upper Snake Basin, which is primarily what contributes to the ESPA. And so the thought was, we'll put this 5-year pilot project out, and if it's successful, then the state and water users would come to the table to start providing funding. And so that's exactly what happened, and they were successful, and that project is still operational today. So between that time and between the state's participation, water users in the Wood and the Boise River basins came to the table and asked Idaho Power Company to partner with water users in the basin and begin projects in those basins. And so those kicked off in about 2014, 2015 time, which is about the first time that the Idaho Water Resource Board or the state made its first contribution to funding in cloud seeding. And that was done with an initial contribution for capital funding, about $500,000. That was used for generators to build out our program. 2016, so we made some changes in how the board was funding. So we started with funding a little bit of capital. 2016, we started contributing towards operations and modeling. At the time when we first came to the table with that, the idea was, we'll split it 3 ways. The state will pay a third, the power company with interest in hydropower will pay a third, and water users will pay a third. It hasn't quite panned out like that, and I'm not going to get too much into that. I will touch briefly on some of those challenges. But 2019 is essentially when we reached our existing level of build out, which consists of 3 aircraft, 57 remote ground generators, and a network of weather instrumentation. And so this is the map that I did show earlier. Again, we have our West Central Mountain region over here on the left-hand side, the Payette River Basin with this kind of long fork in the top, the Boise in the middle, and the Wood over here. And so each of these basins in this region share generators both on the divide, and they do have generators that independently support their basin. And then we have an aircraft, 1 aircraft between the Payette and the Boise, and another aircraft that is split cost between the Boise and the Wood River Basin. And so water users across the Boise and the Wood River Basin each share costs for some of those operations. And as well as share some of the costs with Idaho Power for the aircraft that is shared as well. Over in East Idaho, these green dots that you're seeing is the manual generator program that I talked about, the High Country RC&D program that's been operational since the 90s. And they've done so, again, just on localized funding. So this year is the first year that they have reached out and asked for state support, and we're working with them right now to figure out what that looks like moving into the future. Some photos of our aircraft. You've seen some of these photos today. We do have only the collaborative program anyway only operates remotely operated ground generators, and these are ground generators that have been built, developed, maintained, and ran since the inception of the program. And so Idaho Power has built and developed these. They've made improvements upon these, and we have about a good 20 years worth of data running these types of generators and making continual improvements. So here in Idaho, we're pretty proud of the generators that we have, and I think it would be our state's goal to move forward with the same type of infrastructure. But we are, as you heard from some of our presenters earlier, there is a very limited resource in terms of cloud seeding infrastructure and operators. And so one thing our state is challenged with right now is moving into other areas of the state where the power company may not have interest. How are we going to support that infrastructure potentially from other vendors or operators? And so we do run aircraft as well. Pictures of those, you've seen a few of these already today. Weather instrumentation, I'm not going to get into this. We do have a pretty full network of weather instruments across all of our projects to support accurate forecasting and analyses. Like all other programs, we do have guidelines for our program operations. We do conduct our annual ground schools for planning, and we are supported by a team of atmospheric scientists 24/7 around the clock from November 1st until about April 15th or the 31st for aerial. So high level, this is sort of the juicy information that everybody always wants to know of our West Central. I'm going to show you both our West Central Mountain Project and the Eastern Snake. And so you heard from, during the monitoring and analysis, primarily these speakers that you heard from were from Idaho, and that's largely because we're really the only state who has taken the evaluation, at least in depth, beyond the target control or beyond the precipitation measurement. And so I'm not going to get into how we do that, but these are some of the estimates, that we've come up with and the cost to operate these programs. And so the Boise River Basin, this is on an average annual basis that we're estimating in CAF, or 1,000 acre feet of water on an average annual basis. And so this is averaged, over the time that the project has ran. This is not necessarily, the exact amount of water that you'll get in every single year. Just like the water year, we have good years and bad, but on average, these are the numbers that we see across these basins. It's about 273 in the Boise. The cost for that one is about 910. Theirs is a little bit higher because they share 2 aircrafts, one with the Wood and one with the Payette. The Wood River Basin, they don't have quite as much infrastructure here. Going back, so that program, it does have a little bit less and it does cost a little bit less. Payette River Basin, we do have some numbers in here for reference as well for what Idaho Power estimates they get out of the Payette and their cost for that. Upper Snake River Basin projects, these ones are a little bit bigger. Geographically, the Upper Snake Basin project is similar in size to the entire West Central Mountain region. So over in the Snake River Basin, we have about 25 remote ground generators and a single aircraft to target the basin. This is definitely a basin where we've contemplated adding some additional aircraft, and we still kind of have that on the table, funding dependent in the future. But overall, our estimates for what we get out of this basin is about 632,000 acre feet on an average annual basis. And so this program collectively for all the generators and the single aircraft, which they don't share costs with. So that's one of the reasons why you're seeing a significantly increase in cost on the Snake is because they don't have other basins to share this cost with. So that is just absorbed between the state, the power company, and those local water users. They don't have leveraging funds to share. So I'm not going to get into this. This was just a high level of target control we've already talked about. This is a quick snapshot, though, of our target control estimated increases. So the Payette is our longest running project that Idaho Power has, so that's the place where we have the most amount of data. But on average, you can see across the state, we generally maintain close to 10% of an average annual increase across all basins. So summarizing that for the collaborative program, current cost of annual operations, and this does include Idaho Power's cost for the Payette, and then the total average annual runoff generated. So about 1.2 million acre feet on an average annual basis. That's a pretty significant chunk of water, that we're, and then this is across all state or across the state, so all basins. But when you put that into the cost benefit, $4.2 million for 1.2 million acre feet, that roughly pans out to, $3.50 an acre foot, which is pretty cheap water across the West. So when you're looking at a $4 million program, yeah, that's pretty expensive, but the return on water that we're estimating and for how critical water is, that's pretty valuable. So current priorities for the collaborative program, like I said, the state has really come to the table very recently. So while our operational program is very much state of the art, the state as a public agency is very much in the infancy of developing, sort of the administrative side of the program. So we still have a lot of things to figure out from the administrative part. And I would say our current priorities are one, what is the state's role? What are we going to fund? What is the state's participation going to be in the long term? And what is going to be the long-term role of stakeholders? We talked about collaborative agreements, doing longer term versus year over year. We want to see longer term commitments. How is the program going to be funded long term, and who are we going to create those agreements with? Assessing opportunities for program expansion or enhancement. So this was a directive that we were given, and I'll talk briefly about this from legislature a couple years ago. But we were directed to assess opportunities for program expansion and enhancement. And so one of the other considerations is how can we grow and be more effective? So we definitely have other basins across the state who are very much in need of water and would like to see cloud seeding. But the state is really trying to take a step back and develop a structure for the existing projects that we have that have been operational for quite some time. So most of you know, developing a state program is no short process, and developing a cloud seeding program is not really one that we have a how-to manual on how to do, as you've heard from us today. Every program kind of does it a little bit differently, and that's because our challenges are differently and our water needs are different. And so ongoing monitoring and analysis is another thing, we've talked about today. How will we ensure the long-term effectiveness of the program? So this is a quick snapshot of the timeline. This is relative to the state's participation. So I talked about the ESPA camp was really when the board or the state first came to the table. This shows when our projects kicked off in the Upper Snake River Basin. The WRF weather mod, I will briefly talk about. So this is something you heard about quite a bit earlier in today's talks from NCAR and from some others. So our state has contributed a pretty significant chunk of funding into developing out this model to support our program. And that really kicked off in 2011, initially funded 100% by Idaho Power, and the state has been funding about 50% of that model development since 2017. So I have a star here that really just shows the state's participation coming on about 2014 compared to when our programs have started. Some of our capital costs, that started about then when we started paying for operations and maintenance. 2017, we started paying for model development. And then the blue ones that you're seeing down here are individual projects that are either currently going on or we have done. The modeling, I'm not going to get too much into this, you've heard a lot, but sophisticated modeling is really necessary, or we've deemed it very necessary here in Idaho for planning and development, forecasting, guiding operations, and analyses. So I'm not going to talk too much about these models, but the one thing that I will say is, as Mel alluded to earlier, if the state of Oregon comes online with a cloud seeding project, that pretty much eliminates our control sites for being able to evaluate our programs. Which is a pretty big deal because as a state or as a public agency, we have to be able to demonstrate a cost benefit to using these public funds. And so we have to have some sort of a mechanism to evaluate our programs and be able to respond, to our use of these public funds. And so modeling is really kind of the next frontier of the cloud seeding program and how we answer some of those questions. So I think that's really critical. I'm going to skip over some of these modeling. Well, real briefly, I do want to touch on some of the funding. Again, I mentioned Idaho Power did start some of the funding for this, with the state coming on later. Our initial development costs that the state, between Idaho Power and the state, have put into this model is about $5 million. So that's a pretty significant chunk, that we've contributed to this cloud seeding model and the development. We have currently, as of a couple of years ago, we are doing ongoing model development. As models are never done. I'm sure you've probably heard that about every model. But you did hear from Dr. Tessendorf and a number of others that there is still a lot of improvements that need to be done to ensure the accuracy of these models. And so currently, the state and Idaho Power Company have each split costs for about $2.5 million. And that's in addition to a $300,000 Water Smart grant that we obtained. And what this work is doing is taking data from Snowy, so the field effort that you saw with the radar, the zigzag patterns, and using that data to update and validate the model. And so that's necessary continued work that needs to happen, and we are contributing funding to that as well. This last July, we are looking at expanding our projects into some other basins. We currently do have some feasibility and design going on. So we have contributed additional model costs to develop out the model for some of those basins as well. One thing that we didn't touch on, though, today with the modeling aspect, that I think is very critical and we're figuring out as a state is lots of modeling means lots of computing. These models need a lot of computer power to be able to run these multiple simulations, multiple ensembles. And so you can't just run this on your desktop computer. These things require significant supercomputing space. And so back in 2019, the state and Idaho Power partnered with Boise State University and the Idaho National Laboratory for purchase of a large computing system. Our capital for that was about $1.47 million. Annual administration, so that cost to keep this computer running is about $80,000. We split that with Idaho Power Company. And this computing resource is used for both our cloud seeding operations, but for research as well. And so what we've found out very quickly over the last several years is our program has rapidly grown, and we've started doing all of these analyses and evaluations, is that we outgrew that computer very rapidly. And so we are currently looking for other resources that may include cloud-based, potentially a new, more computing equipment or lease space on other computers. But I think this is something that all programs should be very mindful of. If you would like to get into the modeling aspect to better be able to evaluate your programs, you absolutely need to think about the computing aspect to be able to support those models. You have to have something to run them on. So in some of our talks today, we talked about, how to, the modeling, or the monitoring and analysis portion. And we talked about, some of the components of how do we evaluate cloud seeding? How do we know how much water we're generating? And what does that translate to in water on the ground? And so you heard from Mel, this is sort of my diagram of how this works. But the state of Idaho, about 3 or 4 years ago, started on what we're calling a cloud seeding impacts analysis, because we have been asked this question by lots of folks. You know, our stakeholders contribute to this program and they want to know, well, what's the impact? How is this benefiting me? And so we tried to take a stab at answering this question. You know, and so our objective for this project is to estimate, you know, roughly how cloud seeding operations impact hydrology in the Piet, the Boise, the Wood, and the Upper Snake River basins. So our first cut at this, it took about 1.5 years. It was a very high-level, simplified analysis. It did not include, you know, some of the significant modeling advancements that we've heard today. And so because of that, and because we didn't have, you know, a high level of certainty in some of those results, the board directed us to start phase 2, or, you know, a higher or a more in-depth evaluation for this. And so that part of it, it does involve the more detailed modeling. And so really what that looks like is currently, you know, we're taking target control, which is the only resource we have now. I think you heard from Dr. Tessendorf and some others, you know, that there's still a lot of improvements that need to happen to models to be able to use them for evaluating the precipitation. But right now, we use target control. So essentially how this works is we figure out how much precipitation was generated, and then we plug that into how does that translate to water on the ground. And then the third aspect of that is, okay, well, you know, you have X amount of acre feet that translates to on the ground. Now, where does it go in the system? And so to do that, we're using a Riverware. This was the last presentation that David Hoekema talked about, an operational or a regulatory model. So the Riverware is actually a planning model that was developed by the Bureau of Reclamation for the Upper Snake system. And so what we've done is take this Riverware model that was meant for planning purposes, but it very much captures all the regulatory aspects. And so we've been making improvements to it so that we can take that target control. How much precipitation did we increase? How much water does that need? And we can run it through the system and sort of see where that increase in supply pans out. And so that's a project that's been sort of ongoing. We're learning because the tools are really still under development to be able to do an analysis like this. So we have learned a lot, and there's a lot of good takeaways. And we're very excited to finally be presenting some of these results to our board here in the next couple of months. But the next, as I mentioned, this is an ongoing type of analysis, and largely because the tools are still under development. And so really the next phase or the next frontier of this analysis or being able to evaluate cloud seeding is to get away from the target control and use something like the WRF weather mod or the cloud seeding model to generate or better generate that precipitation for us. So again, as I mentioned, you know, for us here in Idaho, we're very excited for folks over in Oregon at the prospect of getting cloud seeding online. I myself am a native of Central Oregon. My family were irrigators, so it's very much near and dear for me to see them get a project off the ground. But unfortunately, what that means for the state of Idaho is that we will lose our control sites for evaluating our program, as I mentioned. And so the next frontier for us is going to be moving away from target control analyses and using WRF weather mod to be that first input for the precipitation generation. And so largely, you know, right now this evaluation is targeting our existing basins of operation, but ultimately we'd like to be able to use this resource to evaluate other projects as well. And as well, the Riverware model, the planning model, still has a lot of improvements that needs to be made in it. Things like reservoir operations, some of our groundwater responses. We have some pretty cool groundwater models here in Idaho, but they've had some upgrades recently. And so, you know, making all those transitions, improving the diversions, looking at flow augmentation, recharge. There's a lot that goes into the development. So legislation, this is a pretty key piece for the state of Idaho. About 2 years ago, the state of Idaho, under House Bill 266, this was the first time that we had legislation that really created a state agency that's responsible for cloud seeding and gave some directive to that. And so House Bill 266 directed the board to continue the analysis of cloud seeding projects. So the analysis that I just mentioned, it directed us to complete an assessment of opportunities for cloud seeding in other basins, knowing that there's water users across the state who would like to see support. And it also gave the Water Resource Board the authority to authorize cloud seeding programs in Idaho. And so in Idaho, we don't have any licensing or permitting, and it's actually specifically stated in our legislation that permitting and licensing is not required. In lieu of that, you have to obtain authorization from the Idaho Water Resource Board. And so what does that mean? Well, this happened 2 years ago, so we're still kind of figuring that out, you know, what the authorization means, what is the state's role, you know, what should the regulatory mechanisms be. And so right now what an authorization means is really just a reporting mechanism for us to track, you know, what some of these operations are doing in our basins. And so we came up with some criteria to obtain an authorization that basically includes, a detail of what the project is that you're operating, what type of materials you're operating, when you operate, and it requires annual reports as well as a requested update for authorization if there is any changes to the program. And so this year, for example, Idaho Power Company is putting some liquid propane generators in their Payette River Basin project. That would be an example of something that would trigger, a need to get a new authorization. But otherwise, those authorizations are currently indefinite. I'm not going to cover that again. The statewide assessment, this was something we contracted out to NCAR. Basically, what it did was just take a high level of the state and look at all of the areas that have high frequency of seeding opportunities. And so that's the coloration that you're seeing in these maps. On the left-hand side, we have a map of seeding opportunities for the ground layer, so the 0 to 1 kilometer, and then for the airborne seeding layer on the right, in the 3.5 to 4.5 kilometer, which is based on our safe mean flight level. Feasibility and design studies. So you heard folks talk about this earlier. So in the state of Idaho, we kicked off the Bear River Basin study a few years back. That was completed last December, and we actually just finally presented that to our board here in September with the final results. And we are currently working with the state of Utah and potentially the state of Wyoming to look at potential partnerships in the Bears. That is a tri-state basin. So again, going back to leveraging funds and collaborations, that is very critical. And so the Bear River Basin is one project we are hoping to get kicked off next. But again, we have a lot to figure out as a state agency for our existing projects. So that really is our focus mainly right now. The other basin that we've kicked off for feasibility and design is the Lemhi River Basin. The Lemhi River Basin borders the state of Montana, who has also just recently gotten funding for feasibility and design for a project just across the border. So we have also started conversations with the state of Montana about potentially sharing infrastructure between those projects, which would give us the ability to leverage funds between states. So leveraging funds, I cannot stress enough, is probably the most critical to being able to fund sort of the gold standard of a program. Some research and development efforts. I'm not going to get too much into these, but we have kicked off some research efforts on liquid propane as a possible alternative to cloud seeding. So you've heard earlier from some folks, liquid propane has a warmer, it can seed or nucleate ice at warmer temperatures. So as the climate continues to change, this may be an opportunity for us to enhance our program. It's also cheaper to operate, so that's another consideration we'd like to think about. So we are currently working on a proposal to potentially get some support from the state of Utah and some other funding participants, because we definitely recognize that we are not the only ones interested in this research. Although I think the state of Idaho definitely feels like we've taken on, a pretty significant chunk of the funding in some of this. And so we are currently looking for collaborative partners, to support us in some of this research as well. On the instrumentation side, we've been working on the development of what we are calling a SWEDAR device. This is meant to essentially be a micro SNOTEL. So implementing SNOTEL sites are very, very expensive. It's also a pretty lengthy process to get SNOTEL sites in. But we really need that data to be able to efficiently evaluate your program. You really need those data points. And so because it's so expensive to get SNOTEL and because of the need for data, we've been looking at developing these micro SNOTEL devices. And we did finally get a prototype out that's being deployed this winter. So we're really excited to see how that does and potentially get these implemented to our project in the future. So I'm just going to wrap up here really quickly with our budget. So we do have a pretty sizable budget. Like I mentioned, we started in 2014, 2015 with a $500,000 contribution. So that's a pretty significant change in the last 5-7 years to go from 500,000 to 7 million. And that's because we've had some great support in our state for cloud seeding, and we've been able to, maintain these collaborations. So, our board funds this year we're funding about 2/3 in total of the costs for our collaborative program. Some of the water users in those basins will be expected to pay some of that as well. And the other 1/3 of that is paid for by Idaho Power Company. So we did set aside, again, money for instrumentation, for the modeling that I've spoke of, that's pretty significant. And some potential funding for new infrastructure. And you will see that we do have, a good chunk of money set aside for research and development as well. So this is the last one I'm going to wrap up with. Again, our program priorities. These are basically everything I talked about before. What's our state's role, the role of stakeholders, securing those long-term agreements, ensuring that we have somebody to operate and fund this program into the future. The next step beyond that, once we can figure out the structure and the collaborative agreements, is assessing opportunities for expansion or enhancement. So how can we support other areas of the state? How can we continue ongoing monitoring and analysis to ensure that we're being effective